Hello, and welcome to this episode of Inside Legal ESG. My name is Pamela Cone, and I am proud to be the host of this podcast series. Today, we have with us Ivy Lumia, the CEO and founder of Best in Governance, also known as BIG, which is a firm specializing in providing modern, sustainable corporate governance and ESG solutions to transform, elevate, and empower boards of directors and their teams. She has more than 25 years' experience in public, private, non-for-profit, and government sectors. And I was fortunate enough to meet her earlier this month when she was part of the faculty at the Legal ESG Toronto event. Welcome, Ivy. I'm so excited to further our conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me today, Pamela. It is indeed my pleasure to get on a soapbox and talk about something I'm so passionate about, and that's governance.
Yes, excellent. So I want to start, tell us a little bit about your career and how you got to be the founder of Big.
Sure, thanks. Thanks again. Absolutely. I've been supporting boards, oh gosh, for almost 26 years. And you can imagine 26 years ago, the boardroom looked very different than it does today. And in that time, I saw that traditional governance frameworks, they had a lot of systemic governance risk gaps. Maybe the company was incepted 100 years ago, or there was a material matter that was impacting them, and they just weren't set up for what they needed in today's evolving boardrooms. And as agendas became more and more complex, we saw conversations hitting the boardroom table, environmental concerns, social inequities, things that traditionally weren't discussed at the boardroom table. And as the role became more and more complex of directors, they were struggling to figure out how to wrap their arms around it all. And so, realizing that, with the rise of ESG and corporate governance, I realized that there was a little bit of a misalignment between an organization's corporate strategy and the ESG strategies that were being built in a silo. So, launched my company 3 years ago, and we're now one of the fastest growing governance firms in Canada, award winning. And I'm so proud to be a champion of what we call sustainable governance. And basically, sustainable governance broadens the definition of traditional governance, which typically just looked at governance through a keyhole, operations and shareholder value, where today the definition of governance has been broadened to include environmental factors, social matters, also economic factors, and also stakeholder capitalism. And really, at the end of the day, governance is just about a board's ability to make effective decisions and oversight. And again, when these boards are completely overwhelmed by a myriad of competing strategic priorities, sometimes they don't understand the multidimensional factors that can impact the risks at the board level, and they're ill prepared. So at Big, we're really keen to help boards understand what their governance risks are and provide them with evidence-based practical solutions to wrap their arms around it all.
So when you attract a new client to Big, is it because they recognize they have challenges and issues and want your support, or is it a matter of you educating them about what they're not seeing, the risks that they don't even know because we don't know what we don't know, sort of thing?
Exactly, and that's right on. And I think it's a little bit of both. I think that in general, when ESG started to first bubble up, there was a huge focus on the E and the S. And we saw at first that the G part of it, a lot of organizations thought it was how they governed their ESG strategy. But now, as we move forward, I think people are starting to realize more and more it's not necessarily how you govern your strategy, although that's one component, but it's actually looking at the G in ESG. And that's everything from board composition, performance and dynamics, through to risk management and compliance, privacy, data. There's all these things that are in that G bucket. But really, the challenge was that if you could have all the most wonderful E and S initiatives, but if you don't have strong discipline, governance, strong foundation, then you're kind of building a house of cards. And so these
Mhm.
boards, whether unbeknownst to them or known to them, they didn't have a way to look at all of these risk factors multi-dimensionally. And so now we're seeing traditional governance is really evolving as they consider their stakeholders, evolving board diversity, sustainable procurement, all these great initiatives. And I also think that for some companies, especially because we've seen a lot of polarization of ESG, DEI. I think governance is also a safe place to play because at the end of the day, governance is really just about strong decision making and oversight. So if a board is better equipped to understand what risks they have and have more ability to recognize those risks, measure those risks, get more education, they're really setting themselves up for sustainable governance, which is basically to be resilient for the future.
And I think the point you brought up at the beginning of that response is so important, that this isn't just governance about some separate ESG program operating on the side. This is actually the governance of your company. And I would argue that's where E and the F belong as well, because it's strategic decision making about the environment and its impact on you and your impact on the environment. And what is the social structure that's going to support our business long term? These are not a separate program, but rather part of the management, the strategic management of a company.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you raised that because we saw that there was this huge disconnect between an organization's corporate strategy and their ESG strategy that were often built in a silo. But like, we can't kid anybody here. At the end of the day, if the board hasn't bought in into the ESG strategy, it's not aligned, then they might be putting themselves at a disadvantage or they might be missing some serious risks. For example, the one that I like to shock boards with is that by 2030, 70% of the workforce and consumer base will be next gen. Now, they don't want to work for a company that doesn't align for their values, and they certainly don't want to buy the products. So, if you're not considering these types of factors, even supply chain risks, if you're not considering these types of things when you're building out your corporate strategy, considering all that multidimensional way of how your risks have different ways to hit it, then you might be at a disadvantage. So, it's no longer just a way to protect shareholder interests and meet regulatory requirements, but it's also speaking to stakeholders abroad? Like, what are all the risks of your organization?
So you mentioned earlier the political environment that we're working in right now, and related to that topic, I would like to ask you, what are some of the biggest challenges that you're seeing right now in the work you do with your clients, or in the ESG space more generally, whichever you prefer?
Sure, I think we already mentioned the polarization of the terms, but I want to be very clear. ESG is not dead. DEI is not dead. In fact, we're seeing the leading boards in the world doubling down on their efforts. It's just being consumed in a different way. And I think that there's a lot of companies that realize sustainability doesn't mean sacrifice. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The business case has been proven. It improves share price, lowers cost, provides access to new capital, provides new value proposition, and it speaks to all your stakeholder and rights holder values. And so I think that if companies take a more cohesive approach to looking at their risks broader and putting on all those different hats, I think that they realize that there's not only success here financially, but it's also responsibility in its operations, responsibility to its stakeholders. I'll give you a really good example of how we show the value. We work with a company, a leading company in Canada, and they trace and track supply chains. And so when the discovery of supply chains first started, the primary application was they traced and tracked the bottles all over the world, and it reduced the operations and cost of, they found the bottlenecks basically. The secondary application was when they optimized their supply chains, it also reduced their carbon footprint. So that's the secondary application. The third application then we saw was that once you were able to trace and track your supply chain, now it can identify other risks such as modern slavery and
Yeah.
how to optimize your supply chain procurement practices. So now we're seeing a tertiary and fourth way to look at your different risks and optimize them and really create value from across all the different perspectives.
And are you still seeing that regardless of sort of the let's call it a step back, the step back of, for instance, CS Triple D and CSRD in Europe, or the potential step back, or are companies continuing to do this as you described for their own benefit, regardless of what the regulations end up ultimately being?
Yeah, I think that people are going full steam ahead. The reality is, for a long time, and we always call it the board of directors behind the Wizard of Oz curtain. For a
Mhm.
long time, there's been a group of people that have been making the decisions and oversight for the good of the entire corporation. But as that Wizard of Oz curtain has been pulled back, people are stakeholders and rights holders are asking, who are these people and how are they making the decisions for the corporation? And so now there's this onus placed on directors to be accountable for the decisions that they're making and broaden how they're doing it. Are they educated? Are they being well informed to make these decisions? And you can't just operate in a silo anymore because, with the rise of stakeholder capitalism, people are realizing, gosh, those stakeholder risks are our risks, and we need to get in line.
Well, and to your point, boards who are making decisions behind the Wizard of Oz curtain and not considering the broader picture, one could question, are they failing in their fiduciary duty? If, for instance, they don't consider the impact of the environment on their, physical buildings in 10 and 15 and 20 years, that to me would be not fulfilling your obligations as a board member.
Absolutely.
Although there are certainly people who argue the other side of that coin. So,
For sure.
yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But then when we talk about like things that are evolving, one of the things I really believe is evolving would be is director liability. And although, haven't seen too much of it, we see some legal cases coming out the UK regarding environmental concerns, but there really hasn't been too much really in terms of directors being held personally liable for their decision making. But this is absolutely changing. And we see it with one example here in Canada, the new legislation in Canada for forced labor and child labor, where directors are being held personally liable up to $250,000 each for not submitting their report on modern slavery. And so as we see more and more legislation, regulations, and just good governance practices coming forward, directors are realizing, yes, there absolutely is an enhanced liability, fiduciary responsibility here.
Yep, absolutely. And yeah, I hope that the boards of directors here in the US as well as throughout the world will recognize that not considering things in a more holistic way is going to be a disadvantage for their organization, if not to them personally. So
Absolutely.
if we were to talk 1 year from now, what will have changed? What will we be talking about in May of 2026?
Well, I do think the director's liability would be one of them. I think that that's evolving, and I think it will continue to evolve. It would just tip the iceberg on this one, but I think we'll continue to see more and more, directors being held personally liable for the decisions that they make. I also think that organizations are going to start doubling down on their governance efforts. I made mention earlier that it's a little bit of a safe place to play right now, especially because environmental and social, let's be quite honest, it's a little bit under attack, and
Yeah.
people are starting to, come up with the why and the economic burden of it. But the reality is that at the end of the day, no matter what an organization is taking on, if you have strong governance as a foundation for whatever you're going to be doing in the future, it's only going to set your company up for to be resilient in the future.
Yep, I completely agree. And I have one last question for you, but before we,
Sure.
is there anything else you wanted to talk about today or share with us with respect to emerging trends or challenges you see, or what's hot in your area right now that we haven't covered yet?
Um, I guess I would like to say I've worked with thousands of directors, and I can honestly say that the majority of them, they want to champion good governance. They understand that, you have to be a good corporate citizen, a steward of environmental and people and so forth. And so we're seeing a real uptick in innovative board tools like governance risk assessment, education, board evaluations, because traditionally they've been a little bit antiquated. And when you have an organization that has been perhaps rubber stamping, or they haven't evolved their governance structure in 100 years. It
Yes.
doesn't fit for today. And so they're taking a fresh look at their governance perspectives. And at the end of the day, what I would like to say is that every board is unique. Every board has their own culture, their own challenges. I mean, they're all within their own industries and sectors. And so it's essential to understand that there is no one size fits all here.
Mhm.
And you can't do everything and be everything for everybody. So whatever you are going to take on, it needs to be practical. It needs to be fit for purpose and it needs to be evidence-based. Because this makes sense not just for the good of the company, but for all of your stakeholders and rights holders, so that you have a corporate strategy that is aligned to whatever sustainable initiatives you're going to be taking on. And really, at the end of the day, sustainability is just another way to say that your board is being positioned for a resilient future.
Resilient and viable, right? Because so many
Yes.
people use the word sustainable to only mean, green recycling. I find that if the people I'm talking to think of sustainability that way, they're still missing the big picture. So I
Yes.
start to use the word, to your point, resiliency and viability. How viable will our company be given the changes that are happening in the climate in 10 to 15 years? And what are we doing about it, right? That's a viability question, sustainability question, and a resiliency question.
Absolutely.
So in the few minutes we have left, I would love to ask you, in this challenging environment that we've just been talking about that's changing so rapidly, what gives you hope?
Um, okay. The About a few years, I have little ones, and a few years ago, I took my little ones to a fast food restaurant, and they didn't want the meal that came with the toys and the paper and everything like that. And when I asked why, they didn't know how to articulate it, but they said that there was too much garbage and they just
Mm-hmm.
wanted the food out of it. And, when I think about next gen and I think about the evolving way that people think and about how people are now stewards of their neighbors and their communities and looking at that viability that you mentioned, I think that's what gives me hope. People recognize that it's not just for the good of the company, it's for the good of the people and planet. And so that's what gives me hope because I really feel that most people are inherently good and they want to do good. I think they've just been trying to figure out how to balance that with their books. But now that we've seen the data and how it does strengthen your organization, I think that it's easier for boards to pursue these initiatives.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you are not the first person in this podcast series to talk about what gives them hope is being the future generations.
Yeah.
I'm obviously of a more senior generation than you are, and your generation gives me hope. And for you, it's the next generation that's giving you hope, which is wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights. And I hope that if there are board directors serving on boards out there that could use your help, that they will reach out to you. How can they find you, Ivy? Because I know they can look for you on LinkedIn. What's your website?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, Pamela. This has been a lot of fun. They can reach us at our website, which is www.bestingovernance.com, or they can reach out to us at info@bestingovernance.com. Or don't be a stranger, just DM me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to have a chat about governance anytime.
That sounds wonderful. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Pamela.